Hello everyone, today we look at the reluctant soldier, motivations and hardships of early modern military recruitment. We're coming a bit back on our lottery topic choice, given that we have, in case you didn't notice, really exaggerated with specials, even though this is going to be probably the norm, at least for a while. At least we get back on track in terms of views and so on, because there is a favorable wave at least to exploit, and in the meanwhile we're building up further bases for, in fact, coming back also to some more normal topics. You probably wouldn't see the difference because in any case they're very homogeneous in theme and scope with the other ones. However, these more theoretical, conceptual aspects of especially ancient regimes military, I think, are quite relevant. We started them since the dawn of Schwerpunkt channel, and as such, I think they're a very constitutive part of the same, because they explain certain sort of moral aspects that are often sort of not represented and sometimes properly denied, averted for ideological reasons mostly. But they're very deeply intertwined with basically the entire political, military, and social picture of the time. They were even central in essentials. In fact, there is one aspect of warfare that rightfully should be, I think, reconsidered: the evidential, the one of command, the one of the actual strategic choice. This is something that in military analysis is very rarely done, right? Especially when you look, it's not much of a what-if scenario, but it's trying to imagine what could have been properly the options at disposal of this or that commander, understanding how and why the way a campaign takes shape is so meaningful, and how, in fact, different things could really go in theory, provided that the way they actually go are, in this sense, also in an almost metaphysical or actual metaphysical sense, the ones that did actually happen. I mean, for the sake of grounding yourself into reality, it's not like von Clausewitz says there aren't strategic quantities deriving from possibilities, right, that are readily evident, especially the larger the engagements, right? So at that point, it's even easier to understand why, in fact, one thing would go in a specific direction rather than another more conveniently, because it's more out there, it's almost more obvious. But because this is, in fact, the only way you can understand what actually happens in the reality that you're living in, right? And so everything is consequential from that. There is, in this sense, an attention to command, to leaders, and we know that on Schwerpunkt, this is important for a number of reasons, not just the ones I just exposed. There's also the religious one. We talked about this in tradition. But for a moment, given that we encompass the entire body that these armies actually were, setting aside the grandiose trappings of military glory and heraldic symbols and all the hierarchical and, in the sense, medium implications in the relation between commander and soldier, one has also to wonder about the anthropology, the human, intended properly in a deterior sense, aspect of this all. That is to say, who did heed the recruiters' drumbeat, and what drove them to do so? And there is all a literature about this, because it's somehow easy to read, a diary or just some even famous piece of literature that already at that time was essentially erratically diverging from the highest spheres, so the most interesting and the most important side of the story, also to a bit sort of not necessarily make satire about it, but to gradually undermine even the authority and therefore the effort put in this. And that's why I also called this video, I don't know whether I'm going to use the same term, the reluctant, the recalcitrant soldier. Because, of course, war is an instrument of politics, is entirely dominated by that, and there may be countless reasons why anyone may join the army, also against his own will, we made a video about gang pressing, as a matter of fact, that was an incredibly common way of enlisting, up to very recent in time, where even admirals simply remained. They had their entire military career truly from that early abduction and ended up being even very capable commanders. However, there is a more average picture that today we can try to trace on the basis, in fact, of the rank and file trooper. We will talking here in a very generic fashion. This could be the 17th, the 18th century, even before, and there are certain aspects that are frankly also very interesting to report with today's military, which is a topic that we will be looking at in this comparative fashion surely soon at some point. And it's obvious that there can be an overarching frame to provide with the answer to the question of who would actually join the ranks of death, so to say, or at least probably of the army, these killing machines that indeed bled very much themselves right at a point, even to annihilation. Well, individuals might respond to this call for obviously a variety of reasons, including one that, again, can be seen as more sort of religiously even adaptive to the reason why, as we've seen also from antiquity, the Middle Ages, especially the professional soldiery, if so we can say also for certain contexts like war bands and so on, had done so, right? We have seen how through the Gefolgschaft, the Fiannas, the Comitatus, the early war bands of the mists of the early mists of history, that is properly the idea of the necessity of breaking your own idleness, the fact that the more you shelter yourself and the weaker you become, and that fundamentally there is a way to augment your own existence in a transcendental direction, right? There is actually a more extreme ending point. It is properly the one of sacrificing yourself for a holy cause and with actual capacity to make this trade, which is the one of actually abandoning, of realizing the mendacity of humanity, of existence, of the fall. The fact that literally with being a martyr in combat, so witnessing to the deity in combat, summoning the darkest side of yourself and taming them can really earn you a place in the firmament, right, for in fact, triumph over what was known in ancient times as the second death, right? What was important, one could argue already, was the journey, right? The Bella Vita Militare, in one of the greatest musical masterpieces in the history of mankind by Mozart and Da Ponte, is properly, in fact, at that point, illustrated as some sort of mockery, because in that moment, Cherubino, which is literally, in this sense, an angelic figure, and so it's not a coincidence that it's associated to this idea. It's actually a servant, right? But it's the idea that he can't really join the ranks of heaven by essentially being sent to the meat grinder as a punishment, and therefore the non più andrai area is definitely mocking at that point at the end of the 18th century, so in a basically post-traditional reality, regardless of the fact that Mozart was quite sort of traditional in many ways. But in this sort of subtle, almost populistic criticism of the authority, or at least a way of mocking it, that actually in tradition just pertained to the lower strata, to the lowest estates, and that, however, was in that sense, because of the actual power of the higher cases, was not seen as much of a problem. Actually, in order to maintain the system effective, there had to be such almost counter-cultural dimension, right? Not a granitic, sclerotic, and therefore dead sort of order without life, without somebody at at the bottom that had to be lorded over to be also augmented and continuously used also as a source of somatic material, literally cannon fodder at that point. This is literally how they would have seen it, aristocratically speaking, in the 18th century. Why there was an obvious difference in rank between people. We'll talk more about this subject, because again, here I just made an example from Le Nozze di Figaro, but the the literary evidences here are enormous, right? There is all an anthropology, a culture, a pamphleting, etc. that, especially in the 18th century, a moment in which, in fact, the soldiery was increasingly sort of injected in larger numbers, right? At least in the state, in the so-called absolute, the weren't absolute. Like Napoleon's state would be fundamentally absolute as the law, as the the state as the sole source of law. But in this increasingly larger scale, and therefore needing a broader political justification for sending all these people to die. Naturally and obviously, this still happened in a clientelary system whereby these people depended on an elite that was the one that decided the most. And of course, the revolutions are sort of next, just behind the corner, so to say. And that balance will be shattered, and this would bring to some of the most catastrophic, in fact, cataclysms in the history of mankind. Some things about it were actually positive, but many others, especially in terms of the further deterioration of the individual's value, were definitely there. And everything in this sense is a choice, as much, in fact, as going to war for a specific reason, yearning for adventure. Naturally, we don't want in this video to take away the most. Here we want also to be provocative ourselves, but there is a plethora of reasons in a strictly political sense where you understand that there was a general feeling, and in this sense, overlapping from the side of the masses with the actual motivations that would bring dynasties, royal dynasties, at war against one another. It is a sort of aristocratic sport, as we often remind that there can't be any government without the decisive majority of the people supporting them, which in the sort of materialistically decerebrated worldview here requires the specification that, of course, the decisive moral majority is not the decisive majority of the people, simply because people are not equal to one another. And so, of course, there is always a minority that actually is superior and controls the other, also to their own benefit. Otherwise, civilizational development would have never actually come. But it's obvious that there was a national feeling well before any age of specific nationalism that is essentially a post-traditional view of the imperial Catholic traditional view of the nation. And it's actually much more aggressive and impactful and effective and truly felt way than nationalism. Nationalism is watered down for lesser people. It has nothing to do with the supreme understanding of the sacrality of the nation of ancient times. Also because it was properly located in a Catholically, that is to say, universally hierarchical sense, as opposed to some kind of paranoid isolationism and other passive-aggressive attitudes that always are symptomatic of the deeply rooted inferiority of a people. Now, when you look at, of course, adventures, it is really a provocation, but never underestimate for example, the theological precedents for this. For example, the crusade was chiefly understood as an armed pilgrimage, right? The same rites of passages that brought people into manhood and so on were historically connected with the idea that if you went into the army, and so you basically were put under this massive pressure and having to necessarily find a solution out of that through literally battling through somebody else's body and life, you would acquire some sort of very soundly expendable characteristics that will be effective for the entire civilization. In fact, there's a beautiful fairy tale by the Grimm brothers, which is Bearskin. A few people actually know this, and I will surely make a video about this, because especially as far as the theory, the sociology, the politology of the Prussian reforms of the mid-19th century, the ones inspired also by von Clausewitz. And so this idea of a citizen soldier that, however, is not sort of too citizenly abstracted as some pure rationale that belongs just to the divine, but to the actual human that has, in this sense, to revest properly the beast, to grow in something greater, in something that a man can handle, but being in this sense superhuman through military experience, and also in a broader social sense, in a sexual fashion. For example, I don't know, that the veteran is more regarded in the sexual hierarchy, that there is some greater control that he can historically exercise on the household, on the serfs, depending on which period you look at. And so it's going to be a more in fact, aristocratically effective individual in society, at least to the extent he will have successfully mastered certain specific characters. This is the best case scenario that, as you know, also from a historical point of view, is unfortunately not quite the case for lots of people that come back from wars, and especially in particular situations. But there is at least one inspirational dimension to this that can be, for example, in a larger scale, it's a more soundly perceived when, for example, a country wins, right? When, think about, I don't know, the Roman Empire, think about the kind of confidence that Western civilization acquired just by the achievements of Alexander, right? Of Augustus, and what this historically meant for the world as well, what is still possible can be achieved. This is truly overlapping with the divine, as we know in both cases. And what many people today, for example, just perceive in an almost instinctual fashion is truly that path to adventure that they today are properly brought up without even knowing where it's supposed to be led, right? There is, I think I made a Q&A this year that was exactly, what about, today's war? What does it mean to go to war today and divinely transfigure? And that was an interesting question because it was also asked to me from a follower that makes funeral services for, I think, the Marine Corps in the United States, and it was incredibly impressive, and also especially being told by a person who does such a thing that my content helped him dramatically to understand better what this whole thing is about. So definitely I'm still not perhaps ready to go full sort of contemporary regarding this, because naturally there are also lots of interesting studies today, but they're often bent through by a psychologistic, also fundamentally just comforting, and you don't worry, it's as if something negative happened. You look at, for example, those there are two ways to this. You can whine over what happened to you. If you think that this thing happened to you as opposed, you actually joined, because let's be honest, unless you were drafted and you were particularly renitent, there are also conscience objections, all this stuff. But in general, also in a strictly political sense, if you are put a gun in your hand for whichever reason and you use it, there is not the excuse, oh, well, but I was doing it just because of why they shot me, right? If you are truly believing in something that you're against, you would have not been there. And I think that something goes wrong for you eventually, and so that ex post makes you talk ill, for example, about the military or your country or whatever, is not really clever. It's not really intelligent. And actually, the organizations that tend to actually support through this narrative, like just a part of the veterans, tend to be leftistic in nature and tend to be very often run by women. There's something very, very actually strange about this. There are, of course, this is present also from the other side. There are women who know perfectly well what's the actual deal from the other side, and also from a right-wing, not sort of whiny dimension. Nobody said that it's not a tough thing. But the question is also how, still, at the end of the day, if you're a man, how you react to that. And it's not like you didn't know what war was going to be like, right? This is another myth that you still see in, what was the adaptation from Remarks of a few years ago. I even made a commentary on that. Like, this notion, kids were just thrown into the meat grinder because they thought they were to become heroes. And they, I don't know, in the early 20th century, they didn't know what warfare was. They knew what warfare was. And they didn't just know what warfare was. They also hated the other countries, which was also, in a sense, sort of regardless of the specific examples, also a very well-grounded and motivated thing at the time. And they were absolutely eager, convinced, and aware and responsible for what they did. And even though the shock of war is something that is really undescribable before one has lived it, the myth that people are simply sent to the front without any kind of sort of responsibility or by accident, at 360 degrees at every political, military, and social level is complete BS. It's basically a malicious, pernicious ideology designed to undermine authority and nothing else. We all know from which side of the political spectrum really comes from. So this does not mean that there isn't an enormous degree of misery behind the reasons why many people actually join the military. And this may actually be, and as it often is in the good cases, a great chance of redemption, actually, a great sense of elevation. After all, that's mostly the service today. What's the appeal of the military? Usually, if you look at every country, that there isn't a country where people in the military usually don't come from, say, the poorer areas of the country, or aren't there essentially for monetary reasons. So it's perfectly fine. In fact, I veritably loathe the term mercenary, not just applied sometimes as the leftists do against the military, I don't know, the police, or sort of authorities in general, this sort of enforcers of order. But I'm against the concept of, properly, I think, from a didactic, conceptual, theoretical point of view, against the concept of mercenary, which is something developed at very particular times in history with slightly different bias, and that in fact became particularly negative again in the 19th century. It's not much just a Machiavellian thing that at the time also meant something really different, considering especially what Machiavelli also intended as a in terms of mercenary. Like, the best term is soldier, especially as far as the military professionals are actually concerned. Actually, the notion that there would be some militias that went at war at some point without being retributed in some ways is also wrong. It never quite existed, right? It's like those people who think that, I don't know, before the Marian reforms, the Italic peasant, was overloaded with cheese and salami by his wife, adding, the pans, etc., and that he provided with his own equipment. No, the human society has always organized itself with a degree of centralization, exactly because it's human. That is to say, it's not divine. That there isn't such like an individual self-subsistence. This was true even in the Volksgemeinschaft and during the migration era. There's always an order, a discipline, a hierarchy, because that's the medium, that's the path, as we were saying before, towards highness, towards the transcendental. In fact, matched at that point with the patriarchal order and authority and more. All right. And in this sense, there is really nothing wrong in joining the army as a different profession, which is always going to be different. It's never going to be like one another, not just because, of course, the military is also something very unique in intensity and in broader scope. And so we can also look at the more normal misery of the true motivations, the more mundane ones. In fact, poverty itself. We're talking pre-industrial societies that at this point we're also gradually industrializing, so creating at the outskirts of the same more exceedings, both in a sort of demographic. Even think about the Malthusian cycle. So at some point there was always some scum that you want to gang press into. You know how this happened with you were literally kidnapped. Say you were, I don't know, some guy passing by somewhere, you were just abducted by enrollers, and you literally wouldn't see your home for years, and there was no appeal possible. They wouldn't make it. It was essentially a mob kind of mentality and enforcement. It was terrible, as a matter of fact. But at the same time, some people would actually learn how to like it, in the sense that even at the lower sort of fourth estate essential qualities of these people, and this is kind of, you know, true for, I don't know, even the Macedonian pezzathairoi, or in fact, the Roman, the Marian mules, so to say, the proletari, as a matter of fact. In fact, actually, the very purpose of the military, right? The very purpose of the military, is when things are ready, and so given for good, exterminating the largest amount of people possible. Right, that's the actual purpose of the military. It's not, again, the perspectives of careers. It's not. It's to be a purely slaughtering machine, the single most effective way possible. That's, thank God, the purpose of every military war to this day. Because even though the objective of warfare is technically not the extermination of the enemy armies, von Clausewitz explained to us that given the scale of war, at the end of the day, the objective is at least destroying the enemy army most of the times, given that the enemy is not stupid, and the bigger the engagement, the more, let's say, symmetric, so to say, it tends to be. There's no way but going hand-to-head, face-to-face, and so being designed for being the better exterminator. But how do you achieve that? And this is the actual point. That's why some people would be, in a sense, in the military forever, because once you passed under the initiation that awaited for you in the ranks, you were not going to come back, simply because you were dead and reborn as a different person. Right? This is exactly what the concept is. First of all, you die, you must die, you must be brutalized, traumatized in shocking ways, so that you can reason in terms of you are not a person anymore. You are part of a much bigger body that is much more important than you and the sum of the of your former self and the sum of all the former people who joined this group, because this is way more powerful than the arithmetic sum of the same. And that's the manifestation of the imperium, and that's how you can crush, give these blows to entire enemy armies, countries, peoples taking over the world. All right. And this does not mean, of course, that you don't have a personal identity anymore in parallel to some degree. And it's obvious that, say, if you talk about the 18th century, it's not like that the average soldier really reasoned exactly in these terms. But you would be, especially as a 21st century person, be thoroughly surprised by how sort of conventionally obvious this dynamic was. Even for those who were not part of the military, knew pretty well what actually happened in that. Also because warfare sort of was something that historically involved, at this point, actually a smaller part of the population from a strictly sort of military participation point of view. I'd say it's been estimated that 14th century France had it's a participation to violence higher than, say, the Prussia of Frederick the Great, right? So that was, as you know, a very militaristic, very militarized country state. So there can be comparisons made. Things are going to be watered down a little bit. After all, the bigger the army, truly the less relevant, in fact, the individual is, right? The aforementioned sort of brain rewiring. And in fact, neurocognitive level would happen, usually happen, especially for creating warriors as opposed to soldiers. There are two very different things that people, for unfortunate bad habits, literally think they're two overlapping things, or things that can't really be even confused with one another. That's absolutely not the case. And for the record, the soldiers have crushed the warrior under their heels, right? And so the history of civilization, there is no doubt really about what's the best, right? Because it is actually, after all, the same sublimation, as we were saying before, for bearskin, of the original principle of the war band. What you're doing at that point with a handful, like say a company of 100 people, at that point you do with, 1 million. And again, the work is going to be a bit worse. Just like, a pikeman of the Renaissance was just, not that great in terms of single apological capacities compared even to, a guy with a poleaxe of a few hundred years, of a build, say, a few hundred years ago. But indeed, the pike square was much more effective than the infantry of the previous centuries. I, as you know, come from a video commentary response, at least, to scholarly regarding this matter. So it's actually something very interesting, and it's counterinstinctual to understand. Like, many people literally have some grave deficit in understanding not just this mechanism, but the fact that, without this, you can't properly picture what the armed forces of a country today work like and how, right, compared to the ones of, say, even just a few hundred years ago. So poverty is always one reason. These people needed some kind of money, right? And the military, it's not like the military, showered you in money or something like that, but there was at least some sense of higher regard for you as a soldier than a common guy out there, right? Considering that the wide majority and everything was still reasoned true by cases. Say, in other words, the soldiery was superior to the fourth estate, even though the composition was mostly fourth estaters. As we've seen, this human material was completely rebranded, reforged in a different fashion. You were barely above that, but still, as we will see now, there were also some different anthropological, psychological, and also material economical reasons for preferring the military to an extent. We talked a little bit about this in the video about the Landsknechten. If you're interested in those guys that had they are very sort of hybrid between a traditional sort of medieval estate, almost as their militia, their soldiery, and some sort of modern union of workers, right, in this early modern age. And so it's fascinating to see their rise and fall and what did that pass through also in an anthropological sense. There is also some deterior reason why these people, like, there are people who literally do not work well in society, and so in a sense are designed to be instead fighters and to have also those characteristics that are very useful at some point, like being a psychopath, to be a soldier. Absolutely, say the majority of soldiers are not psychopathic, and there is no doubt that, probably an army of psychopaths would never work. But there is a disproportionate amount of decorations recipients that are actually psychopathic, together with another specific group, and this is very interesting, especially considering how brutal life was back in the day, how short existence was, that is to say orphans, and especially orphans that had to take care since a young age of their family, by working, by being the breadwinners in the home. And I find this very beautiful, because they're two very different categories of people, but they apparently disproportionately cover themselves in glory. In other words, they know that the psychopath just doesn't care about people. Like, also, the average soldier has some sense of humanity, of empathy. The psychopath kills, just doesn't understand emotions. Somebody begging for, help, like, no, we just butcher him down. The breadwinner, the orphan, is instead a guy that is ready to sacrifice for his family. And needless to say, the new family of comrades in arms at this point is exactly your unit, and those you literally bleed with. So this is a very interesting aspect, but as we said, there is also a dysfunctional one for other sort of civil terms. Consider that in the early modern age, there still isn't quite well outlined the difference between civilian and military. Some date it to Grotius, at least as a philosophical theory. There naturally was something like that, because there was always some important distinction between the soldier, even the warrior back in the day compared to the other. Think about the difference between the zip and the comitatus, right? We talked about this as well. But the concept, let's say, that for example, these soldiers would come back to a civilian life that not really exist. There are I personally studied some trials during, I think it were the 14th century, of some, these were mercenary companies of the era. In fact, some of the most, as you know, also the most chaotic moment of mercenary warfare were literally, there were some members of the same that had committed some crimes in a given community and they were arrested. And these trials are documented and they described the human types that existed in this war. And then you found, for example, the good guy, the aristocrat, the guy who has a sense of honor, of chivalry, because let's remember, the backbone of the military at this point still was fundamentally aristocrat, right? Not necessarily in the rank and file troops, although, if you look especially at the tercios, and therefore the Holy Roman Imperial tradition, there was, the idea at least that the aristocrat itself has to start from the ranks. But still, the officiality was the guys who also literally fought and died with their men were there and had to have that leadership role that we just described. And then you would have this guy, that was really described in a way that the guy was under trial, because there were all the witnesses and so they were presented. And you realize from the description of these people, from a psychological point of view, that they didn't have any clue what the difference between civilian and military life was. I mean, as they were used to rape, pillage, slaughter when they were on campaign at war, when they were in civilian life, they used to rape, pillage, and slaughter in the same way to win their money. Because in a way, that's also how straightforwardly some would practice this profession to begin with, right? There was, in this unregulated life, also something excessive, right? The height of violence, brutality. Many people were not just good for steady employment. They were not expendable, just like today. We know that there is a pretty consistent amount of the population that literally does not have the cognitive capacities to be good, even in the military, at some point. And to do the simplest things, to obey orders and so on. We don't know what to do with them. And at the same time, there are people who were just cut for some military purpose, also in a higher, nobler sense. There were also much more say, sociological reasons, so to say, for in a euphemistic fashion. For example, escaping from debts. There were lots of people who were literally escaping their own communities because they had committed crimes, they owed money to someone. Think about the Zaporozhye and Cossacks that literally were welcoming all the criminals from all the rest of Europe because they literally lived in their pirate island on the Dnieper River, and no government could count. This is true also for think about the Caribbeans, faraway places, so to say, in the frontiers of the era, right? You would think it's strange, but there was definitely also a desire to break free from the monotony of daily existence. And this is not such a random or low motivation. As we explained before, the entire culture of the era revolved around the notion that sacrifice was a positive thing, that fighting was for the right cause was good, that there was a reward, that you could even win your place in heaven through such fashion, even by, say, surviving still your military service. And there was a general sense of sort of professional and social promotion baked into it. You could never really know how it would go. Naturally, many people who tried this wouldn't even come back home ever. They died maybe at the first engagement. And that was also the Leviathan in the room of this all. You go, as we were explaining before, in the military to slaughter the largest amount of people as possible, and people in front of you are doing the same exact thing towards you. So the outcome is usually not very peaceful or safe, or something that inspires a great deal of longevity also in your existential planning. Nevertheless, again, the quality earned from such encounters, so to say, was definitely appreciated and revered in society. So to say, not quite. I mean, lots of veterans were as we've seen, not even recommendable, and or they were completely poor. They had lost everything. They had not really even achieved that much. They had not really obtained that much wealth. They had come back poor, and we've seen this. I don't remember talking about Langsknecht, and we know the history of individual men had spent a lifetime of war and came back home really poorer than they had left to an extent. This is not the video about salaries in early modern warfare, but I already made something and we'll make something more about this. As we were saying, there was also a need to flee from some form of retribution or legal consequences. Not like society at the time was that tidy or orderly. We know it was full of incest, of brutality, of violence, of mobsters dynamic. You were subject to any kind of sort of threat of imposition. You owed stuff to people in general, the thugs of your lord, the whoever ruled there. Only people with a certain amount of wealth could afford some legal assistance, by the way, and law was largely also based on some level of private sympathy, etc. So being in the military, paradoxically, could even help you in, say, being in an orderly, disciplined community, at least one where there was some greater, in fact, justice enforced, or it's not like horrifying things wouldn't happen within these units, as we explained, but at large, you were sure. You also acquired some sort of reputation as a guy that, I don't know, had killed other people, knew how to do that, had received a baptism of fire to a degree that was not scared even of certain aspects of civilian life, right? That's where you earn a backbone in that sense. There was no lack of professional wanderers either. Lots of vagabonds, lots of beggars. This is really typical of especially pre-industrial society. The early modern age is a moment in which the poor, the beggars and so on were starting being interned, ghettoed in some suburbs, in some institutions even, because probably there was starting to be a sense of public decency, which was also very fine, something that should be reinstated. There can't be a vagabond. It was closed somewhere. We don't care. We don't need to see these people. We don't give a damn about who they are, why they're in that circumstance. First of all, there has to be some public decency about this all. And in pre-industrial world, things were different, because in general, everybody was so poor that you even saw the thing in terms of vagabondage, for example, in inferior terms. There were even their religious meanings about hospitality, some sort of welfare system shared by the communities that helped those who couldn't afford like something on their own and lived of the scraps of the rest of society. That was already not a particularly affluent one by surplus. There were those who idled by choice. There were habitual offenders, individuals who had utterly failed in life. So these were all very good human material for the army at the time. Under such conditions, it is scarcely surprising that soldiers were held also in low esteem within early modern society for the type that the soldier had started to become. I made an entire video about this that I titled something like Competitive Estate, from Competitive Estate to Scum of the Earth, of some sense. This is true, like, meaning, as we were explaining before, up to the later Middle Ages, even looking at, the Swiss, the Landsknecht, and so on, there was a sense that the soldier was even if he wasn't noble, right, he still owed some part of impairment. There was something elevated about him that, after all, warfare was not yet a mass one. It's during the early modern age, it wasn't a mass one either. We talked about how even early modern armies weren't that big, telling you the truth. But there was definitely a more structured type of military organization, more increasingly demanding sort of logistical needs, organization, technological, and so on. So in this mechanization and gradual enlargement, especially during the 18th century, of the later 17th, 18th century, even before mass society proper of the army's sizes, as we were explaining, the fantassin was really a nobody, right? A 16th century pikeman was, on average, some more relevant person in a societal fashion than an 18th century musketeer in the infantry line. So this is relevant because there had been, especially during the 18th century, all a process of so-called avocation, which is a legal term which derives from the process of exchanging, fundamentally, advocating some rights, basically, of not paying taxes. Most of that was the thing. That historically had created some islands of, again, privilege of immunity in the ancien regime, and that, however, had not been immune from the billeting of the troops. So basically, if you look at, I don't know, the Austria of Maria Theresia or the Prussia of Frederick the Great, that are exactly creating veritable regional forces at that level of sort of international competition in the 18th century. Pass through this mechanism, the idea that you don't want to see the soldiers billeted in your own communities. You prefer to pay taxes, you prefer to renounce those rights, but as long as the military would take care of its own troops, would build barracks, it wouldn't have to, and in this sense, many people were properly sent out of the community because there were some sort of social sewage, some social waste, and they were sent to the front. In order, of course, there was a generalized levy, the older ways of recruitment, the idea that in theory every able-bodied free was always there, like in potential. But we also know that at least throughout the 18th century, armies were, until the French Revolution, essentially largely voluntary, professional forces. Don't get me wrong, as we've seen, there was a lot of compulsion in the enlistment. However, this was relatively limited compared to the mobilization of mass troops. And so at the end of the day, if you entered the army in a regiment, you tended to stick to it. There wasn't, aside from the commissions, from the officers, from I don't know, cavalry units, so certain forces that were historically, or certain levels of the units were historically careeristic and or properly extracted from particular social order. The rank and file infantryman was usually this type of person, extracted from the lower strata of the population, and therefore, generally speaking, despised. Despised in a broader sense. I mean, there were the people, I don't know, someone like Prince Eugene, seeing, I don't know, during the battle, a guy breaking from the line and running away, would simply, shoot him on the spot. Like, you didn't even, these were lesser people, were understood as, again, forestators. Nobody gave a damn about them until they won battles, and in general, the appreciation was mostly for their officers who were aristocrats. Right, so the officers obviously would have sort of loved their men for the obvious sacrifice they would have, but not to the point that they were felt socially close, or that, say, the distance could be simply bridged. On the contrary, this is very underestimated in a historical, anthropological, sociological sense. Traditional cultures were very happy of seeing that there was a divide between people. All right. Of course, like if you gave these people guns, think about what happened. I don't know, during in Russia during World War I. States were quite where they had historically demilitarized, pacified, like disarmed, right, the population because they feared revolt. So obviously, if you gave these people power, they would have taken it back. But in a general sense, the order was so ingrained, and the general logic, as we explained before, in terms of moral superiority, was so functionally distributed in this fashion that even the average person was happy of, say, living under a lord's protection, of being at the orders of that specific aristocrat. They liked the guy. They looked up to him. They realized how much better of a person he was compared to them, and that's why he was in that commanding position. There was a sense of pride, of identity, because the world was really that fractal, right? There were many horizontal divisions as opposed to vertical ones. Regiments were, in that sense, everything for some people. Your community, again, the lordship within whom you live, the same king, the monarchy, that was increasingly overlapping also with the nation and so on, but still under that historical atavic ancien, what we call ancien regime, but in fact is a much older thing in origin, through which the world has always functionally worked, right? And would also be the starting point from which also further developments that destroyed the ancien regime also started from, to further boost and sort of go on steroid in terms of, mass mass society, mass warfare. Although at that point really having a problem of being a headless society, having too many hands that after all do not achieve much. We've seen watering down the quality of the individual in this place and sort of collapsing rather the same, and sort of being ever more chronically difficult to bring forward in any truly qualitative sense. Fortunately, the elites always existed and always pioneered civilization. In any case, and when they failed, they were taken down. It's that easy, right? So, of course, lesser people feel hysterically threatened by the elite, as if, the elite, I don't know, who's the elite, right? If you pick 200 people, obviously there's going to be two that are better than everybody else. That's the elite, right? They're not necessarily the guys that you see overly represented for ideological reasons. They're very powerful, etc., but they are just a part of the elite. We're talking the actual establishment, right? It's another story. When you look also at the human material that was recruited, you realize that they were habituated to some of the most traumatically brutal existences ever, right? Think about the grueling nature of agricultural work and probably the rhythms of the peasantry. From the 14th century onward, in particular, in relative terms, people had it much worse, right? There is this sense that the medieval peasantry was so, oh my God, you're oppressed and enslaved. It's the dark ages, whatever, and the modern age was better. Like the average person had more. In absolute terms, they did have more material wealth, barely, especially before the Industrial Revolution. But in relative terms, they were drastically, right, radically, much less free than they had been in the Middle Ages. And I'm not talking even sort of the Middle Ages in the myth of the guy who's out there with a farm that he rules, because we also never really existed on average. We're talking about even probably the people who lived under, peasants who lived under a lord in, say, the 13th century, right? In some of the most authoritatively led and civilizationally advanced parts of Europe, right? Peasants had much less mobility, freedom, etc. in the modern age than, especially after the 14th century crisis, than it had been in the previous centuries, all right? And in any case, just think about what kind of breeds were selected by this lifestyle, right? They were really living as much as, in the same conditions of the animals they literally also slept with. There were already certain, the more you go ahead in the era here, certain forms of industrial labor, right? And some conditions were so crushing that it's not wonders that people went to great lengths to escape them, provided they possessed enough health and strength to offer their services to an army, especially a particularly young, robust, tall, sound, maybe dull, but in this sense resistant, stubborn, animal-like peasant. Those were the best cannon fodder, the best recruiters material, so to say. And again, they were tough people. If you have an idea of your ancestry of how peasants work, right, and what they do and how they lived at the time, you have a pretty consistent idea of what they looked like. My great grandfather, from the father of my maternal grandmother, born in 1880, struck dead a mule with a single blow, a punch in his forehead. He carried another guy throughout the front in World War I in exchange for his ration. He loaded himself with, he was a miller, as a matter of fact, with this massive sacks of flour on his back. Like he was a giant. He was told mostly, actually for the time, he was much taller than the average. He was told basically like me. And in fact, I also sort of dramatically resemble him in many ways, because also there probably, and this is genetic as well, I mean, there are some genes there were incredibly solid, right? Incredibly bulky, incredibly resistant, and in that sense, they also tended to affirm themselves more. And these were people, again, went to war, come back, like, moved. They had pretty intense lives. When people died, their children died. But for them, they were completely normal people if you met them. And they didn't whine like somebody today really would for literally nothing, right? You can't help but see how even peasants at the time were much more developed human beings than today's average person. Incredibly sounder, resistant, more capable, more intelligent, more strong, properly at both a moral, physical level. It's all what their fiber really was. And consider that you epigenetically disrupt your genes if you are just a lazy ass. You don't do anything your entire life. Your children are going to resent of that genetic degeneration through the ages. This is a very important thing, because you don't just sort of pass down genes as if, they didn't change. You actually have an active effect in improving or degenerating them during your lifetime. It's an incredible thing. And just think about the human type. You'd see, I don't know, and they would have not even looked particularly impressive. Most of these people were naturally very, think about how badly nourished they were. I mean, nourished in pretty short-term lifespan vision, right? Again, very more akin to labor animals than what today we consider people. But in this sense, incredibly sturdy and resilient. In this sense, in a predominantly agrarian world, the enforced idleness of the lengthy winter months could make enlistment appear attractive as well. You see, these peasants weren't stupid in the sense that even if they were illiterate or whatever, they knew pretty well what happened when you went to the army. Also to debunk the myth that, again, people are peaceful and innocent and naive, and then some terrible butcher sent them to World War I to kill people that they shared pictures of their children and they started being friends. This is just a complete alienation from reality. It's a mental illness that spread from the 1970s for, again, anti-Western, communistic, and sort of, all the worst reasons in the world. But nobody at the time thought any of this BS, right? This kind of mentality started appearing from people that did not go to any freaking war, while before it was completely normal to say, okay, well, I have to go die for my country. Okay, bye. Then I came back, I killed 20 people, right? Let's have a family now, or maybe they had already had, okay, let's have other 2 children, and then maybe one died. Well, okay, well, this is normal. That's how they actually lived, right? For not talking about, this is also a scenario in which things went well. Imagine how war itself disrupted so many people's lives in the most horrifying ways. Imagine all the trauma, all the impairment. It was full of physically destroyed people. I mean, already, say, the work of the era did it without all the safety protocols, protections, unions, whatever. Again, people were really treated as actual animals. And this was incredibly useful for the military service as well. And also because it would motivate them to be in a better place. Again, not in a merely passivistic fashion, but literally, okay, let's join the army to an extent. Admittedly, most people did not really want to do so. Most recruits were not really convinced. This is what prepotently emerges from the sources. And so there was always that level of human fall and lack of broader awareness. I mean, depending on the era, naturally, the awareness, especially of the lower strata of the population, of the broader political international reason for fighting, etc., was gradually declining. Just like today, today's people do not have lost any kind of adherence with relative why or how wars are fought or by whom or whatever. They live properly in the most alienated world. Actually, at the time, people kind of understood But in fact, the bigger the scale of warfare increased, the more, at least, there is this sense of sabotage, of defeatism, of pacifism. Furthermore, other technicalities of this, in a predominantly agrarian world, think about it, the enforced idleness of the lengthy winter months could make enlistment appear even more attractive. For example, in the early 18th century, just since we started a series about him, Marlborough, during an especially severe winter, encouraged a ramp-up in recruitment of force, asserting that this was the ideal time to fill the depleted ranks. It was very right? He knew that the peasants at that point, they had still to work. It's not like in winter they didn't work, but they had less to do. They had more contemplative time, and also the pace of operations slowed down. War was also waged in winter since ever, telling the truth, but mostly, as we've seen also in the very campaign of Blenheim, as a matter of fact, and Schellenberg, there was a time of sort of stop, of slowing down. Mostly troops came back to winter quarters, they entrenched. There would be sieges going on and so on, but still, this was a moment of less action, and so it was the best way to get out of boredom some people to enlist. Confronted with the immediate and pressing threat of starvation, even a protracted military campaign, as we were pointing out before, with paltry and inconsistent wages could seem appealing, particularly since in moments of regret, the relatively risky yet fairly simple option of desertion was always available. You could enlist, and then at some point we would really control, right? Think about how many deserters normally existed, and how normal it was, maybe even just in a village, to have someone who had done that, maybe had not said it, but was suspected of something, because the desertion levels were very high. Attrition was incredibly intense. Illnesses, way before then, injuries were normally wearing properly units apart. Besides, think about, this is the age of uniforms kicking in a consistent fashion, but after 2 months of campaign, you don't have a uniform anymore. It's not like these people are that recognizable, and this allows them, in fact, to sort of escape even more easily. All right. The situation deteriorated further when states with considerable caution, hesitation, and restrictions introduced systems of compulsory conscription. We explained why states were so cautious to do so. It wasn't much about the unrest of many communities saying, we don't want to send troops, this costs, we have to take them away from agricultural work and so on. This had always been a problem. We've seen it since, Diocletian's reforms in late antiquity and so on, the Capitatio Iugatio and so on. But regardless of especially the agricultural aspect, there was a more strictly political reason. Arming large amounts of people, especially from the lower strata of the population, was never quite a good idea during the Ancien regime, where, again, war was seen mostly as an aristocratic sport. And again, most subjects were theoretically on board with what was going on, or at least with the notion of taking up arms. Just yesterday, I made a video, for example, about the Battle of Dreux during the French Wars of Religion. And so if you weren't from one side, you were from the other. So remember, the political motivation is always there, and is actually always very strong. It's not like, again, the notion that passed here of the terrible war and people who are angels that don't want to fight it and so on. No, people were quite eagerly wanting to go kill their enemies out there for all the possible reasons that affected them, probably also at a local level. And again, the French Wars of Religion, a very good example, because there were, at that point, it's all intertwined. You're going to live next to someone who has a different religious thought than yours, and you want to steal his home, his goods, and so on. And these are all times in which the same state can do just so much, even in terms of creating an army on its own. So there is a lot of rebellions, lots of instability, etc. And people are habituated, as we were saying before, to that degree of brutality, right? In many areas of Europe, it was completely normal to, go out there, even as cattle thieves, as, think about the epopee of even of the Old West in North America. That's a perfectly concrete scenario of what happens community-wise when there is still not like a sound central authority where everything is out of the control of most states, etc. The more you go back in time, and the more you're going to experience this, and so every person is a bit of weight, a bit of violence, a bit of beating, a bit of throat cutting. It's not like they would have had to do it themselves, which they would on some occasions, but just even the proclivity, the exposure to that, the fact that you would have to do it, so that this fact that the world and life was so unpredictable and short and brutal, and you would see 1/3 of your siblings on their deathbed before they reached adulthood. And so this habituated you to also the irrelevance of life, at least in its let's say the ease with which it could be taken away. Unlike the volunteer recruit, the conscript was typically a deeply dissatisfied individual. That's when things started really to change in a sort of more systemically sabotaging fashion, ideologically speaking. This was the guy we were talking about at the beginning, who refused to accept his fate. For such a person, desertion was not just a last resort, but a constant as alluring fantasy. Economic incentives remained a consideration still for these guys, because it's not like they were simply sent without compensation. Remember that this is always the case, especially as actual soldiers. That's why you call them like that. In ever more permanent, well-identified, robust institutions, that's what you're also being recognized as an ex-soldier later, and again, you would have some assistance from the state in different ways. Think about les invalides, even certain structures, certain communities that would help you. Beyond the basic soldier's pay, the only real prospect for gain, however, in a higher sense, lay in the spoils of war. Again, today we'll not talk properly about the economic side of the story. We already discussed it somewhere, but you know how that was always an extra that was also tolerated under certain circumstances by military discipline. However, pillaging, though to some degree a customary and officially tolerated practice, consistently led to disorder and lack of discipline as well. And so it estranged the goodwill of civilian populations in occupied regions and undermined their economic stability. Besides, it contributed to actually, with the effectiveness of say, the enemy armies, to hate the enemy soldiers and to hate that specific polity, that specific sovereign. Also on a national basis, what was also further agglutinating as such. Consequently, as early as the late 16th century, military commanders grudgingly accepted such behavior of pillaging, but were highly reluctant to endorse it in an open fashion. At some point, they were literally obliged by mutiny. This is the case for the sack of Antwerp and the sack of Magdeburg was probably more one, but in general, at some point, if you didn't pay the troops in particular, you had to have them pillage. Otherwise, they would properly take you down. And there are lots of circumstances where we have seen this kind of new loyalty, this new kind of almost awareness of the status of the soldier, or at least of the state of the units per se, and what they could ask, right? This is typical of the earlier part of, say, of the Renaissance. Later, they had much less negotiable power. And so they, as we've seen, they were also considered properly less as people than before, paradoxically. Financially, looting was also seldom actually lucrative. Right? Prolonged sieges, for example, allowed valuables to be protected or skillfully concealed in numerous ways, when, as was most often the case, a city or stronghold surrendered through negotiations resorting to fire and sword became forbidden. Even if a fortunate and ruthless attack on prosperous city yielded some plunder for a soldier's tattered sack, such gains were short-lived. in fact, the more effective the army is historically, and the more those resources would be properly used by the commander, that historically always had this task of properly distributing the loot in some equitable fashion. Think about Clovis, the Vase of Soissons story, and so on. And there is a lot of politics passing through this, because originally it was believed that the commander was literally the guy who had achieved this to begin with, and that his men were just basically an extension of this medium with the divinity, as we've seen, especially in the war bands and all one. There was some level of egalitarianism as well, whereby if you're a single body, there can't be favoritism. And this is especially true for more primitive realities, where there was also less societal stratification. But of course, the more warfare advanced in organization, and the more everything became more strictly organized, supervised, and well-oiled, properly acquiring an ever more efficient and effective capacity. Therefore, soldiers couldn't really hope for some crazy, wild loot or lack of control from the side of the same military authority, their commanders. And also this was the case if you really cared politically about the communities that you were taking over, for example. As we said before, under Grotius, there was this notion that, more or less spreading across countries, that civilians had to be possibly spared from sort of this kind of brutalities. They had to suffer to the degree requisitions were there, but there couldn't be an indiscriminate level of sacking and just left to the soldiers, and crimes left unpunished, and so on. And this simply was also part of the broader civilizational function. If you wanted to deal with an enemy, if you had really, as von Clausewitz puts it, to make this act of force to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, well, it's not by inflicting extra damage, unnecessary, vicious, also permanent damage. Consider how fragile agriculture was at the time, and so on. How much sweat and tears went into the minimal surplus these people had. Paradoxically, it was something sadistically complex about, in fact, the same peasants pillaging somebody else's farms, so to say. It's as if they had finally said, oh my God, in my life I couldn't steal that chicken from my neighbor, but now I can because I'm fighting against an enemy, right? And so these things sort of only gradually disappear, or at least were subordinated to some ever more concentrated fort. Massacres, violence, looting, this is something that happens to this very day. It's not something you can eliminate or whatever. In any case, at the best, let's say, these loots were traded away at a loss. The logistical framework did not permit carrying cumbersome spoils for long, and with each passing hour, the danger increased that fellow soldiers, by the way, would steal any overly enticing or noticeable loot. It was far from pleasant to sleep with one eye open and a dagger at the ready. Additionally, soldiers were often drowning in debts accumulated through the costs of their own upkeep, gambling, or less savory activities, by the way. The most practical option was frequently to turn to one of many merchant usurers, trailing the armies and sell off in the settler train. In their terms, whatever meager spoils had been gathered. Another potential avenue for profit was the ransoming of prisoners, but this was a practice preserved for the higher strata of society, and in any case was more characteristic of the medieval period. We've seen it the other day in the video about the Battle of Dreux, but we're looking at sort of higher commanders, even properly royalty in that case. Still, however, it was a thing. It was done. It wasn't forbidden, so to say. And in any case, when we look at these realities, we know, generally speaking, how miserable the entire picture really was. And how also difficult it would be for us even to realize how normal certain dynamics are. Because the point here is not sort of judging the thing per se. Obviously, you always have to judge in history. It's not like it's irrelevant or you shouldn't really accept, but it's also a matter, first of all, explaining how or why it worked. Like if you are anxious of judging before understanding how it worked, then you can't properly focus and picture on this reality. There are ways and ways, of course, of doing things, of, say, understanding how the world worked at the time. But at the same time, it's also a matter of really appreciating the dynamic for what it was, and not simply for the, let's say, for what you can spend in a sort of less informed fashion, right? There is always a very interesting way of seeing the story, including surely one of relative, let's say, the very details of this whole, right? That is to say, what are we looking at? Where are we looking at? Which story? It's plenty of this in literature today. I don't want to cover that because I also don't have much time. But in general, right, you know that it existed, that it worked in this fashion, and that it belongs to a world that doesn't quite, it's not very far from ours, right? It's not really that strange to us. And for this reason, you really want to appreciate it in ways that probably you haven't spent much time thinking of before. There are ways and ways to do so, and again, here we're not particularly judging the entire thing. I'm glad, as I said at the beginning, to look at these topics, to appreciate, so to say, the details, the vicissitudes of these troops, of the human dimension of all of this. I made really lots of videos of this kind over the years, and it seemed to me that we went somewhere with them. I attracted lots of new views. I tried to essentially, in fact, discuss something which normally you don't find out there that much at all, and it seems rather also disappointing to a degree. You wanna probably appreciate the fact that, again, we're really the only channel doing this in a consistent fashion. I personally don't know any other content creator that does anything remotely close to what we do here. Sometimes it feels like you have to do, I don't know, thinking that this is just about saturating the videos, say making more videos equates more videos. It's not always the case, but it is about the completion. It is about the ultimate meaning. It's about the fact that if you don't cover particular topics, you can't glue the rest together either. Having all these videos made here, for example, just like, I think it's reassuring. It's basically about looking at some form of, cushion, of something that you can spend, so to say, in, for example, let's say you're curious about this topic or another, you've seen, I don't know, you watch a video about a battle or a set of campaigns of a particular, you wonder, what were the people here doing? What was their motivation? Were the people behind the actors, so to say, the background figures of this, and it's difficult to say sometimes. It's not easy to look at. It's not necessarily easy to discern, but at the same time, you can appreciate the idea that a unit per se, an army, is composed by all these people. That there is something collective about this. That this is not just the story of an individual separated from the group. It's literally, especially in the military, as we explained, being part of something more, being part of a political instrument, being part of something more relevant in the history of warfare, but of politics as well. That's how people at large believed. They weren't, again, people randomly taken from some circumstance without context, without a general, say, awareness of what was going on, as it's all often, and just for sort of later periods complained about, most of the case, the innocent, naive recruit. All right, it's all much more, and it all derives from the fact that people at the time had also some probably closer grasp, not even probably, like depending on sort of what we're talking about, depending on the person, but on average, like it was sort of much more self-evident to a person why at the time a war was fought, right? There wasn't much of a surprise about that. They could disagree, right? But as we see from our history of the art of war and the general campaigns, strategies, and so on, communities were dramatically active. Politically speaking, we realized that everything was incredibly well coordinated at so many different aspects of reality. So again, it's difficult to unsee it. It's difficult to pretend that this is just somebody else, or that there was no actual participation of feeling or whatever. No, it was all sort of almost standardized, or at least sort of very readily understood. I'm here digressing just to lengthen a bit the video. I'm not gonna lie, I'm searching for more pictures that I can from the ones that I saved already that I can insert here. But again, here we are. Yeah, in fact, looking also at other stuff, it's not so relevant. I just don't want here, there's a misproportion, but doesn't matter. Very well, again, I was glad to discuss this video. This is the kind of content that makes Schwerpunkt glue, keeping sort of all together. Some of you are oddly fascinated with this stuff, and it allows me also to draw from non-specials that can research way better, way more. But sometimes, as you've seen, especially in the first part of the video, it becomes very spontaneous, really, to discuss this stuff, because it's so obvious to an extent. It's obvious to realize certain aspects of this people's sociology, psychology, politology, because again, who does even talk about the opinion of people who went to war? In fact, I don't know, in the 17th century. This is honestly one of the most obvious questions as well, right? And we will definitely see this better on some other occasion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video here. I was about to lose, I don't know, the last 18 minutes. I don't know what the hell happened. I just hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.